Before we step into the glittering, treacherous world of London's high society, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these stories of passion, betrayal, and redemption to life. Now, let the music swell and the secrets unfold. The ballroom of Ashford House was a masterpiece of deception. To the untrained eye, it was a vision of paradise. Crystal chandeliers dripping with light, the scent of hothouse jasmine masking the smell of burning wax, and a sea of silk and velvet swirling in time to a string quartet. But Lady Francesca Lovelace knew better. Standing near the refreshment table, her gloved hands clasping a glass of champagne, she had no intention of finishing. She saw the room for what it truly was, a battlefield. At 22, Francesca was the season's crowning jewel. Her coral silk gown was a marvel of modern dressmaking, designed to accentuate a figure that poets claimed rivaled Aphrodite, and her dark chestnut hair was arranged in ringlets so precise they seemed sculpted. By all accounts, this night should have been the pinnacle of her young life. In exactly 3 weeks, she was scheduled to marry Henry Talbert, the heir to the Marquis of Whitehaven. It was the match of the decade, a union of beauty and fortune that had sent ripples of envy through every drawing room in Mayfair. Yet, as Francesca watched, the dancers, her honey-coloured eyes held no joy, only a cold, crystalline clarity. She was watching her fiancé. Henry was undeniably handsome, possessing the kind of golden, classical features that made dowagers sigh and debutantes blush. He moved through the crowd with the easy, arrogant grace of a man who had never been denied a single desire. But tonight, his attention was not on his future bride. For the 3rd time that evening, he was partnering with Miss Arabella Thornton. The impropriety was subtle, barely a whisper of scandal, but Francesca saw it. She saw the way his hand rested a fraction too low on Miss Thornton's waist. She saw the intimate inclination of his head, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but lingered on his partner's flushed lips. Beside her, Lady Catherine Peyton, Francesca's oldest friend and staunchest ally, snapped her fan open with a sound like a pistol shot. Catherine murmured that Henry seemed particularly energetic, her tone laced with a distaste she didn't bother to hide. Catherine had never trusted Henry. For months, she had tried to warn Francesca, speaking in guarded tones about rumours that drifted from the darker corners of London, whispers of gaming hells, of massive debts, and of a certain Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, a married woman known for her discreet but expensive affairs. Francesca had heard the whispers too. For a long time, she had chosen to be deaf to them, wrapping herself in the illusion of Henry's romantic gestures and flowery poetry. But the veil had lifted 3 months ago, replaced by a chilling realization that she had been a fool. She wasn't watching Henry with love tonight. She was watching him with the calculation of a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. The music swelled to a crescendo, and Henry finally relinquished Miss Thornton, making his way toward Francesca. As he approached, the mask of the devoted fiancé slid seamlessly into place. He bowed over her hand, murmuring about how ravishing she looked, but his eyes were vacant, already scanning the room for his next diversion. He dismissed Miss Thornton's dancing skills with a casual cruelty that made Francesca's stomach turn, though she kept her expression serene. When he suggested they take a turn on the terrace to discuss a delicate matter, Francesca's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew. The intuition that had been screaming at her for weeks suddenly went silent, replaced by a grim certainty. This was it. They stepped out through the French doors into the cool April night. The terrace was dimly lit, the air crisp and biting after the stifling heat of the ballroom. Other couples strolled at a respectable distance, their laughter sounding ghostly in the shadows. Henry led her to a secluded corner near the stone balustrade overlooking the dark expanse of the gardens. He began to speak, and Francesca recognized the tone immediately. It was rehearsed. He spoke of hasty understandings and unsuitability, his voice dripping with a faux regret that made him sound like a bad actor in a melodramatic play. He was ending the engagement. He claimed his heart was engaged elsewhere, painting himself as a martyr to his own emotions, trying to let her down with what he clearly thought was benevolence. Francesca listened, her face unreadable. He expected tears, he expected a scene, he expected her to plead, but as he droned on about being fair to her, Francesca felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She interrupted his monologue not with sobbing, but with a question that cut through the night air like a knife. She asked if the lady who had captured his heart happened to be Miss Thornton, or perhaps Mrs. Ashworth, or maybe even Lady Charlotte Weston. The silence that followed was absolute. The colour drained from Henry's face, only to return in a flush of furious humiliation. He demanded to know how she dared to accuse him, attempting to bluster his way out of the corner she had backed him into. But Francesca was done with games. Her voice, low and steel-hard, dismantled his defense. She told him she wasn't blind, nor was she stupid. She revealed that she had been watching him for months, cataloguing his infidelities, his gambling, his desperate need for her dowry to cover his staggering debts. The handsome mask crumbled, revealing the ugly, petulant man beneath. He hissed at her, asking why she hadn't ended it herself if she knew. Her answer was simple and devastating. She had been waiting for him to reveal himself. She explained the social calculus of their world with a cold precision that stunned him. A gentleman ending an engagement caused a scandal for the lady. A lady ending it caused a scandal for the gentleman. But a gentleman ending an engagement publicly in the middle of a ball because he wished to pursue other women, that made him a villain. It made him a cad. Panic flickered in Henry's eyes as he realized the trap he had walked into. Voices were rising nearby. They had drawn an audience. Lady Ashford herself was watching from the doorway. Francesca raised her voice just enough to be heard by the onlookers, declaring that she would not stand in the way of his heart's wandering affections. With a decisive movement, she pulled the heavy sapphire engagement ring from her finger, a ring she knew he hadn't paid for, and pressed it into his clammy palm. She wished him happiness with a finality that sounded like a curse, turned on her heel, and walked away. Leaving him sputtering in her wake, Francesca moved back through the ballroom. The whispers started immediately, rising like a tide around her. Heads turned, fans hid delightedly shocked expressions, and the eyes of the ton devoured the scene. She had given them the scandal of the season, but she controlled the narrative. She found Catherine, gave a brief, reassuring squeeze of her hand, and continued toward the exit. She could not stay. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her trembling, and she needed to escape before the cracks in her composure became visible. She collected her cloak and stepped out onto the front steps of Ashford House. The night was vast and indifferent. Her carriage would take time to arrive from the mews, and for a moment Francesca stood alone. Under the gaslight, breathing in the cold air, the weight of 3 wasted years pressed down on her. She thought of the girl she had been, naive, hungry for romance, easily swayed by Henry's empty gestures. She thought of the man she had rejected to choose Henry, Richard Wickliffe, the Duke of Westwick. Richard. The memory of him was a sharp pang in her chest. He had courted her 3 years ago, not with poetry, but with serious conversation and intense, quiet attention. He had intimidated her then. He was too serious, too direct, too real. He had warned her about Henry, and she, in her arrogance, had accused him of jealousy. She remembered the last time she had spoken to him properly, at a charity gala 6 months into her engagement. He had told her that if she ever chose to walk away, he would be there to catch her. It had seemed like a fantastical promise then, the kind of thing men said but didn't mean. The sound of hooves on cobblestones broke her reverie. A carriage was approaching, but it wasn't her family's. It was a magnificent black equipage, sleek and imposing, drawn by 4 matched horses that breathed steam into the night air. The ducal crest of Westwick gleamed in silver and midnight blue on the door. Francesca's breath caught in her throat. The carriage halted directly in front of her. The door opened. Richard Wickliffe sat inside. He was still wearing his evening clothes, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, as if he'd been running his hands through it in agitation. His grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw an expression that stopped her heart. Hope, raw and unguarded, mixed with a terrifying uncertainty. He didn't smile. He simply noted in that quiet, deep voice that shivered down her spine that she appeared to be in need of a carriage. He didn't demand. He didn't gloat. He told her that the choice was hers. Francesca looked back at the house. Through the windows she could see the silhouette of the crowd, the hive of gossip she had just disturbed. If she stayed, she would be the subject of pity and scorn for months. If she went back to her parents, she would face their fury. She looked back at Richard. He was the man who had waited, the man who had seen the truth when she was blind, the man who was offering her not just a ride, but an escape. Without a word, she descended the steps. She placed her hand in his outstretched one. The contact was electric, his grip warm and impossibly solid. He helped her into the carriage, his movements careful as if she were made of glass. As she settled onto the velvet squabs across from him, the door clicked shut, sealing them into a private world of shadows and silence. "Drive on," she said to the coachman, her voice trembling slightly. Richard looked at her, his intense gaze searching her face. He asked her destination. She paused, her heart beating so hard she felt dizzy. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want to go to Catherine's. She wanted to go somewhere where the whispers couldn't reach her, somewhere real. She asked him how far it was to his estate in Kent. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. To go to Kent with him, unmarried and unchaperoned at this hour, was social suicide. It was ruin. It was madness. And it was exactly what she wanted. When Richard realized what she was asking, the transformation in his face was blinding. The austerity vanished, replaced by a joy so profound it illuminated the dark carriage. He gave the order, Westwick Abbey, best speed. As the carriage lurched into motion, pulling away from the curb and picking up speed, Francesca didn't look back at the life she was leaving behind. She watched Richard. They were speeding through the London streets, leaving the gaslights behind for the dark country roads, heading toward a future that was entirely unwritten. The wheels clattered against the stones, a rhythmic drumbeat marking the seconds as they crossed the line of no return. She had made her choice. But as the city faded into the distance and the carriage plunged into the velvet darkness of the countryside, Francesca realized that the true danger wasn't the scandal she left behind. It was the intense, silent man sitting across from her, and the terrifying realization that she might have just traded a cage for a whirlwind. The carriage ride from London to Kent was not merely a journey across miles, but a traversal of the vast, silent distance that had stood between Lady Francesca Lovelace and the Duke of Westwick for 3 years. The interior of the ducal equipage was a capsule of velvet and shadow, insulated from the sleeping world outside. For the first hour, the silence was thick, heavy with the magnitude of what Francesca had just done. She had severed her ties to society with the violence of a guillotine blade, and now she sat opposite the man who had caught the falling blade. Richard did not press her. He did not fill the silence with the empty platitudes Henry would have offered. He simply sat in the darkness, a steady, anchoring presence, allowing her the space to dismantle the panic rising in her chest. As the city lights faded into the sprawling obscurity of the countryside, the conversation that finally emerged was not one of romance, but of brutal honesty. Francesca, stripped of her social armor, asked the question that had haunted her since she stepped into the carriage: why he had waited. Richard's answer was devoid of the flowery poetry she had once craved. He spoke of certainty. He explained that he had watched her for 3 years, not with the obsession of a stalker, but with the patience of a man who recognized a fundamental truth that she had yet to see. He admitted to positioning himself at every ball, every gala, ensuring he was a constant, peripheral presence, a safety net woven from shadows, waiting for the inevitable moment when Henry's facade would crack. Francesca realized then that what she had mistaken for coldness in Richard was actually a terrifyingly intense focus. He hadn't been indifferent. He had been holding his breath. The journey stretched into the early hours of the morning. The rhythm of the horses' hooves on the road became a hypnotic drumbeat, marking the passage of their old lives. Francesca found herself confessing her own foolishness, the vanity that had led her to choose Henry's glittering surface over Richard's depth. In the dark, without the need to maintain eye contact, barriers crumbled. Richard listened without judgment, his responses measured and grounding. He offered no false comforts, only the assurance that mistakes were the architects of wisdom. By the time the first grey streaks of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer the rejected suitor and the foolish girl. They were conspirators in a great escape, bound by a shared, scandalous secret. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the Kentish landscape in hues of rose and gold, the carriage turned through the massive iron gates of Westwick Abbey. The estate did not emerge gently. It commanded the landscape. The abbey rose from the morning mist like a structure from a Gothic novel, its ancient stone walls cloaked in ivy, its towers piercing the sky with an air of timeless permanence. Yet, unlike the forbidding fortress Francesca might have expected, the golden stone seemed to glow with a quiet welcome under the morning light. It was a place of history, of roots deep in the earth, a stark contrast to the superficial, transient world of the London ballrooms she had fled. The arrival was executed with military precision. Despite the ungodly hour and the scandalous lack of a chaperone or luggage, the household staff of Westwick Abbey reacted with a disciplined calm that spoke volumes about their master. Stevens, the butler, opened the heavy oak doors before Richard had even fully descended from the carriage. There was no flicker of surprise in his eyes, only a bow and a respectful welcome home. It became clear to Francesca that Richard commanded not just obedience, but absolute loyalty. He gave orders for the rose room to be prepared and for the housekeeper to attend to Lady Francesca, his voice carrying an authority that required no shouting. Francesca was led into the entrance hall, a cavernous space smelling of beeswax, old wood, and fresh flowers. Portraits of long-dead Wickliffes stared down from the walls, stern men in armor, dour women in ruffs. But the house itself felt alive, breathing around her. It was here, in the transition from the public spectacle to the private sanctuary, that the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was a guest in a bachelor's establishment, ruined in the eyes of the world, dependent entirely on the honor of the man standing beside her. She was escorted upstairs by Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, a woman whose motherly demeanor masked a sharp, observational intelligence. It was in the privacy of the rose room, while Mrs. Davies helped Francesca out of her crushed ball gown and into a borrowed nightdress, that the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. Francesca, probing for information, asked if Richard had ever brought a woman here before. The housekeeper's answer was immediate and emphatic: never. Mrs. Davies then revealed the truth of the last 3 years from the household's perspective. She spoke of the Duke's withdrawal from society after Francesca's engagement to Henry, his long months of solitude, and his quiet, unyielding declaration that he would wait because she would come to see the truth eventually. This revelation struck Francesca harder than any declaration of love. Richard hadn't just moved on. He had lived in a state of suspended animation, building a life around a hope that had seemed impossible to everyone but him. As Francesca sank into the crisp, lavender-scented sheets of the bed, exhaustion finally claiming her, the image of the cold, distant Duke was replaced by the realization of a man of profound, almost terrifying endurance. She slept for hours, a deep, dreamless slumber born of emotional depletion. When she woke, the afternoon sun was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a fleeting moment of disorientation, she reached for the familiar anxiety of her engagement to Henry, only to find it gone. In its place was a terrifying freedom. The panic she expected did not come. Instead, standing in the center of the strange room, Francesca felt a surge of exhilaration. She was ruined, yes. The London papers were undoubtedly eviscerating her name at this very moment. Her mother was likely in hysterics, but she was free. Dinner that evening was set in the small dining room, an intimate space lit by the warm glow of the hearth. Richard had changed into fresh evening clothes, and the sight of him, relaxed, in his own domain, took Francesca's breath away. The conversation that ensued was a delicate dance. They sat across from each other, the table acting as both a bridge and a barrier. Richard, ever the strategist, laid out the situation with clinical detachment. He proposed marriage, stating it was the only way to salvage her reputation. He offered her a long engagement, a period of time to live at the Abbey while they courted properly, to ensure she wasn't acting out of rebound or trauma. He was giving her an out, a way to slow down the train. She had boarded, but Francesca had spent 3 years moving slowly, measuring every step, and it had led her to the brink of a loveless marriage. She listened to his reasonable, honorable offer, and she rejected it. She didn't want time. She didn't want a long engagement to appease a society that would gossip regardless. Across the candlelight, she saw the man who had waited 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days for her. She saw the truth of him. In a move that surprised even herself, Francesca countered his proposal. She demanded to be married immediately, not next year, not next month, but as soon as the law would allow. She watched the shock register on Richard's face, followed by a dawning, incredulous joy. She explained that she had made her choice in the carriage, or perhaps even before, on the terrace when she realized he was the only one who had ever been honest with her. She chose him not out of obligation, but out of a fierce, sudden certainty. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the shift from theoretical discussion to tangible reality. Richard stood and came to her, his movements stripped of their usual restraint. He verified her intent one last time, needing to be sure this wasn't madness speaking. When she confirmed it, the last barrier between them dissolved. He didn't just agree, he acted. He declared he would ride to Canterbury the next morning to procure a special license from the Archbishop. They would be married by the week's end, but the sanctuary of the Abbey, comforting as it was, could not hold them forever. As the plan solidified, a new determination hardened in Francesca's eyes. She refused to hide in the country like a shameful secret. She told Richard that once they were married, they would not stay in Kent. They would return to London. They would walk into the lion's den of Mayfair, attend the season's balls, and force society to look them in the eye. They would turn their scandal into a triumph. Richard looked at the woman he had loved from afar, seeing the steel spine beneath the silk, and smiled. It was a dangerous plan, one that risked further humiliation if they faltered. But as he took her hand, sealing their pact, the atmosphere in the room shifted from sanctuary to war room. They were no longer just escaping a bad engagement. They were preparing to conquer the world that had tried to crush them. Yet as the candles burned low and the plans for a hasty wedding were drawn, neither of them noticed the shadow moving in the garden outside the window. A lone rider who had followed the carriage tracks from London, carrying news that would complicate their triumphant return before it had even begun. The rider who had arrived under the cover of darkness proved to be the catalyst for the inevitable. He bore not a threat, but a critical instrument of their salvation, the special license from the Archbishop, procured through Richard's extensive influence and a significant courier fee. With the parchment in hand, the suspended reality of Westwick Abbey shifted into a rapidly moving current. There was no time for elaborate trousseaux or the reading of banns. The sanctuary they had claimed was temporary. The war for their reputation waited in London, and they needed to forge their armour before returning to the battlefield. 3 days later, the small Norman church bordering the estate opened its heavy wooden doors for a ceremony that defied every expectation of high society. There were no choirs, no banks of hothouse lilies, and no pews filled with whispering peers. The only witnesses were the silent stone effigies of Richard's ancestors, the household staff who filled the back rows with respectful silence, and Richard's cousins, Lord Edward Hartley and his wife Margaret, who had arrived from a neighbouring estate in a flurry of support and curiosity. The atmosphere was stripped of pageantry, leaving only the raw, unadorned weight of the commitment being made. Francesca stood at the altar in a dress of cream silk provided by Margaret, a simple gown that lacked the ostentation of her abandoned wedding dress, but possessed a quiet elegance that suited the ancient stone surroundings. When she spoke her vows, the words did not echo with the theatricality she had once rehearsed with Henry. They were quiet, steady, and terrifyingly real. Richard's voice, deep and resonant, filled the small space as he promised to worship her with his body and endow her with his worldly goods. It was not a performance for an audience. It was a binding contract between two souls who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to remain. When he slid the heavy gold band, engraved with the Westwick crest, onto her finger, the metal felt warm, a tangible weight that anchored her to a new identity. She was no longer Francesca Lovelace, the jilted girl who fled a ballroom. She was the Duchess of Westwick. The wedding breakfast was an intimate affair, a stark contrast to the grand reception that had been planned for her union with Henry. Yet, as champagne, dusted off from the deepest recesses of the Abbey's cellar, was poured, a sense of profound relief settled over the room. The toast offered by Edward was not about dynasty or fortune, but about the end of a long, painful waiting game. It was during this quiet celebration that Richard pulled Francesca aside and presented her with his own offering, a necklace of sapphires and diamonds, an heirloom worn by generations of Westwick brides. As he fastened it around her throat, the cold gems warming against her skin, the transaction was complete. She had given him her trust. He had given her his history. Their wedding night passed behind the closed doors of the Duke's chambers, a vast room dominated by a four-poster bed and windows that looked out over the moonlit gardens. It was here that the final transition occurred. The nervousness that Francesca expected did not materialize in the way she feared. Instead, there was a sense of inevitability. The intimacy they shared was not the frantic, stolen passion of a scandalous affair, but the deliberate, patient exploration of a man who had waited years for this moment, and a woman who was finally realizing what it meant to be truly seen. In the darkness of the room, The last ghosts of Henry Talbert were exorcised, replaced by the living, breathing reality of a husband who treated her not as a conquest, but as a counterpart. However, the idyll of Westwick Abbey could not last. The morning after the wedding, the reality of their situation arrived with the Daily Post. The letters were few, but their contents were venomous. The news of their flight had not just reached London, it had set the city on fire. The gossip sheets were speculating wildly, painting Francesca as a seductress and Richard as a rogue who had stolen another man's bride. To stay in Kent would be to admit defeat, to let the narrative be written by their enemies. Richard proposed they could remain in the country, shielding themselves with distance, but Francesca refused. She understood the rules of the game better than anyone. Hiding was an admission of guilt. The preparations for their return were made with the grim determination of a military campaign. When the carriage rolled out of the Abbey gates, heading back toward the smog and noise of the capital, the mood was markedly different from their flight. They were no longer running away, they were advancing. The journey was tense, the silence filled with strategy rather than uncertainty. They knew exactly what awaited them, the cold shoulders, the cut direct, the whispered insults behind raised fans. But this time, Francesca sat with her head high, the heavy gold ring on her finger serving as a talisman against the coming storm. They arrived at the Westwick townhouse in Grosvenor Square in the late afternoon. The house was already active, the staff having been sent ahead to prepare for the master's return. The fires were lit, the covers removed from the furniture, and the sheer scale of Richard's wealth was on full display. It was a fortress of privilege, designed to intimidate. They had barely crossed the threshold when the first test of their new alliance arrived. It was not a friend, but family. Lady Margaret Lovelace, Francesca's mother, swept into the drawing room with the force of a gale. She was a woman who had spent decades curating a flawless reputation, and her daughter's midnight escape had shattered it in a single evening. She was trembling with a mixture of fury and humiliation, ready to unleash a torrent of recriminations. However, the dynamic in the room halted her. Francesca did not cower. She stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, radiating a cool composure that was entirely new. Beside her stood the Duke, not as a suitor seeking approval, but as a husband protecting his wife. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in social maneuvering. Lady Margaret began with accusations of ruin and shame, but Richard intercepted the tirade with a calm, icy politeness that sucked the oxygen out of her anger. He did not apologize for the scandal. He reframed it. He pointed out that while the method had been unconventional, the result was that her daughter was now a duchess, a rank far superior to the one she would have held as Henry Talbert's wife. He then delivered the piece of intelligence that changed the entire tenor of the conversation. Henry Talbert was finished. Richard revealed, with the casual detachment of someone discussing the weather, that Henry's debts had been exposed the morning after the ball. Without the prospect of Francesca's dowry to secure his creditors, the house of cards had collapsed. The Marquis of Whitehaven, furious at the public embarrassment, had exiled his son to a remote estate in Northumberland to rot in obscurity. Henry was not a victim. He was a pariah. The news struck Lady Margaret with the force of a physical blow. The narrative she had constructed of her daughter as the villain crumbled. If Henry was ruined, then Francesca's escape looked less like madness and more like a stroke of genius. The fury in Lady Margaret's eyes was replaced by a calculating gleam. She was a pragmatist above all else. A ruined daughter was a liability. A duchess, however scandalous the circumstances, was an asset. She adjusted her shawl, the lines of tension around her mouth easing slightly, and grudgingly accepted the situation. She warned them that her father would demand a meeting and that society would not be so easily swayed. But the venom was gone. She left Grosvenor Square not as an enemy, but as a tentative, if reluctant, ally. The days that followed were a study in isolation. The invitations that usually flooded the home of a Duke were conspicuously absent. The knocker on the front door remained largely silent. Society was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The ton was divided into entrenched camps. The younger, more progressive set viewed the elopement as a romantic rebellion, a dashing act of love that defied stuffy conventions. The older, conservative guard saw it as an affront to decency, a dangerous precedent that threatened the stability of the marriage market. Francesca and Richard moved through this vacuum with deliberate visibility. They were seen riding in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, impeccably dressed, talking and laughing with an ease that unsettled the onlookers. They attended the opera, sitting in the Westwick box, ignoring the hundreds of opera glasses trained on them instead of the stage. They did not look like a couple burdened by shame. They looked like a couple sharing a private joke at the expense of the world. Catherine proved to be their staunchest defender, visiting daily and reporting on the shifting tides of opinion. She brought news that the initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a grudging admiration for Richard's decisiveness. But admiration was not acceptance. The true test of their reintegration into society had yet to come. It wasn't enough to be seen, they had to be received. The opportunity arrived in the form of a thick, cream-coloured envelope bearing the crest of the Bransford family. Lady Bransford was the doyenne of London society, a woman whose influence could make or break a reputation. Her annual ball was the highlight of the season, the event where the social hierarchy was solidified. To be excluded was death, to be included was a pardon. When the invitation arrived, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Westwick, it was more than a piece of stationery. It was a summons to trial. Francesca held the card, her fingers tracing the calligraphy. This was the same ballroom where Henry had ended their engagement. It was the scene of her greatest humiliation. Returning there meant walking back into the exact spot where she had been broken, but this time she would not be walking alone. Richard watched her, knowing exactly what the invitation represented. He didn't ask if she wanted to go. He knew she had to. The waiting was over. The sanctuary of the Abbey and the fortress of Grosvenor Square had served their purpose. Now the doors were opening and the lions were waiting. As Francesca placed the invitation on the mantelpiece, she felt a cold shiver of anticipation. They had survived the escape, the wedding, and the family. Now they had to survive the ballroom. The carriage ride to Bransford House felt less like a journey to a social engagement and more like a transport to a tribunal. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on the cobblestones, usually a soothing sound, echoed in the confined space like a countdown. Inside the velvet-lined compartment, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Francesca sat straight, her spine rigid against the upholstery, her gloved hands folded demurely in her lap to hide a slight tremor. Beside her, the Duke of Westwick radiated a calm that bordered on unnatural. He did not speak of the trial awaiting them. Instead, he watched the passing gaslights with a predatory focus, his mind undoubtedly calculating angles of attack and defense. They both understood that tonight was not merely a ball, it was a public referendum on their marriage. Bransford House was ablaze with light, a beacon in the Mayfair night that drew the crème de la crème of society like moths to a flame. The line of carriages stretched down the street, a parade of crests and liveried footmen. When the Westwick carriage finally pulled up to the entrance, the footman who opened the door paused for a fraction of a second, a hesitation barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but screamingly obvious to Francesca. It was the first ripple of the storm. Richard descended first, ignoring the footman's pause, and turned to offer his hand to his wife. As Francesca stepped onto the pavement, the night air hit her flushed skin, but it was the weight of the stairs that truly chilled her. Even on the steps, before they had even entered the building, eyes were turning. Whispers were already taking flight. They ascended the grand staircase, the announcer at the top, waiting to herald their arrival. This was the moment of truth. If the room fell silent, if backs were turned, if the cut direct was administered by the leading hostesses, their social lives in London would be effectively over. The announcer's voice rang out, clear and booming, "The Duke and Duchess of Westwick." The reaction was immediate and visceral. The hum of conversation in the ballroom didn't just fade, it was severed. A silence descended that was so absolute, so heavy, it felt physical. Hundreds of heads turned in unison. The sea of colourful gowns and stark black tailcoats parted slightly, creating a gauntlet of judgment leading to the centre of the room. Francesca felt the urge to shrink, to look at the floor, to apologise for her existence. But then she felt the pressure of Richard's hand on her arm, steady, unyielding. An anchor in the gale. He wasn't hurrying her through the gauntlet, he was parading her. He guided her forward with a deliberate slowness, forcing the onlookers to acknowledge them, to look them in the eye. He looked at Francesca not with the shame of a man caught in a scandal, but with the pride of a man who has secured a prize beyond measure. They had taken perhaps 10 steps into the room when the verdict was delivered. It did not come from the crowd, but from the throne. Lady Bransford, the hostess and undisputed queen of the evening, detached herself from a group of countesses and moved toward them. The room held its breath. Lady Bransford could destroy them with a single cool look or a pointed comment about the weather. Instead, a genuine smile broke across her formidable features. She extended both hands, greeting them not as pariahs, but as honoured guests. Her voice, pitched perfectly to carry across the silent room, commented on how married life evidently agreed with the Duchess, noting that she was positively glowing. The tension in the room snapped. If Lady Bransford accepted them, the herd would follow. The silence shattered into a renewed, louder hum of conversation, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer the murmur of scandal. It was the buzz of curiosity. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. Francesca was no longer the fallen woman. She was the romantic heroine. Richard was no longer the villain. He was the dashing hero who had swept her away. The guests, taking their cue from their hostess, began to approach. The braver ones came first, offering congratulations that were only slightly tentative. Then, seeing that no lightning bolt struck the first wave, the others followed. The true victory, however, was cemented on the dance floor. By strict convention, a husband and wife did not dance together frequently at a ball. It was considered insular, even rude. Richard ignored this rule with the arrogance that only a duke could command. He wrote his name on Francesca's dance card not once, but 3 times. When he led her out for the first waltz, the floor cleared. They moved together with a fluidity that spoke of a deep, intuitive connection. Those watching, and everyone was watching, saw something that was rarely visible in the arranged matches of the ton: genuine desire. Richard looked at his wife as if the rest of the room did not exist. Francesca looked at him as if he were the only solid ground in the world. The gossip that circulated behind fans transformed from malicious speculation to envious longing. The scandal was losing its teeth. The romance was taking over. Later in the evening, Francesca found herself standing near the terrace doors, the very same doors she had walked through with Henry Talbert weeks ago to have her heart broken. The symmetry of the moment was not lost on her. Richard appeared at her side, handing her a glass of lemonade. He too recognized the location. In a quiet voice, he revealed a detail he had kept to himself until that moment. On the night of her breakup with Henry, he had been watching from across the room. He had seen the resignation on her face, the calculation in her eyes, and when she had walked out onto the terrace with Henry, Richard had signalled his coachman to bring the carriage around to the front. He had known. He had prepared the escape route before she even knew she needed to flee. The revelation struck Francesca with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been waiting for 3 years. He had been actively guarding her, poised to catch her the moment she fell. The Bransford ball marked the turning point. In the weeks that followed, the Westwicks did not just reintegrate into society. They began to reshape it. Francesca, emboldened by her survival, shed the persona of the demure debutante. She had tried so hard to be for Henry. She stepped into her role as Duchess with a vigor that surprised everyone, perhaps even herself. She did not limit herself to tea parties and gossip. She became an active partner in Richard's world. She sat in on meetings about estate management, her sharp mind grasping the complexities of crop rotation and tenant rights faster than many of Richard's stewards. She accompanied him to political dinners, where her insights into social reform silenced the older men who expected her to merely look decorative. The Westwick clique became the most exclusive circle in London. It was not defined by lineage alone, but by intellect and wit. The conversations at their dinner table were not about who was sleeping with whom, but about the Corn Laws, the industrial crisis in the North, and the literature of the day. Francesca found the intellectual stimulation she had starved for during her engagement to Henry. She realized that her previous life had been a performance in grayscale. Her life with Richard was in Technicolor, and as their star rose, another fell. News of Henry Talbert filtered back to London, not as a tragedy but as a sordid farce. The exile to Northumberland had not humbled him. It had made him desperate. Stripped of his allowance and facing debtor's prison, Henry had been forced into the very thing he had tried to trap Francesca into. A transaction. The rumours were confirmed. He was engaged to Miss Georgiana Hartwell, the daughter of a wealthy sugar merchant. It was a match made purely of necessity. Miss Hartwell's father was known to be a ruthless businessman who was demanding a marriage contract so watertight it would leave Henry with an allowance no larger than a schoolboy's. He had sold his title for safety, trading his freedom for a ledger. When Francesca heard the news, she waited for the anger, the vindication, the schadenfreude, but none came. She felt only a distant, mild pity. Henry was no longer a villain in her story. He was a footnote, a cautionary tale of a man who chased the surface and drowned in the shallows. The months turned into a year, the seasons changing the landscape of their lives just as they changed the gardens at Westwick Abbey. The scandal that had birthed their marriage had faded into a legend, a romantic anecdote told at dinner parties. But within the walls of their home, a new reality was taking shape. The partnership they had forged was about to face its most significant evolution. It began with subtle changes, a fatigue that Francesca could not shake, a distaste for certain foods, a fainting spell during a particularly stifling afternoon tea. The physician was summoned to Grosvenor Square, a discreet man with cold hands and a serious demeanour. He spent an hour with the Duchess, while the Duke paced the library floor below, wearing a path into the expensive Persian rug. When the physician finally descended, he did not look grave. He looked satisfied. He delivered the news that would secure the Westwick line and irrevocably bind Francesca and Richard together. That evening the house was quiet. They did not host a dinner or attend the opera. They sat in the private study, the fire crackling in the grate, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Richard sat in the wing-back chair, pulling Francesca into his lap with a tenderness that belied his size. They did not speak of titles or succession or the triumph over society. They spoke of names. They spoke of nurseries. They spoke of the terrifying, wonderful reality that they were no longer just a couple. They were a family. Richard placed his hand on her stomach, flat and unchanged to the eye, but harboring a seismic shift in their universe. He confessed that for the first time since she had climbed into his carriage, he was afraid. Not of scandal, not of Henry, but of the fragility of life itself. Childbirth was a battlefield of its own, one where rank and wealth offered little protection. Francesca covered his hand with hers, feeling the tremor in his fingers. She felt the fear, too, the shadow that stalked every expectant mother, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, blooming joy. She looked at her husband, the man who had engineered her rescue, who had stood like a fortress against the world's judgment, and she saw the vulnerability he hid from everyone else. They had won the war for their reputation. They had won the war for their happiness. Now, they were standing on the precipice of a new frontier, one that couldn't be navigated with social strategy or political influence. It required simple, raw endurance. As the fire died down to embers, Francesca rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The past was a conquered country. The future was a fragile, unmapped wilderness, and as the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, signaling the end of the day, they both knew that the easy part of their story was over. The real work of building a legacy was about to begin. The final battle for the future of the Westwick line did not take place in a ballroom or a parliamentary chamber, but in the master suite of Westwick Abbey, 9 months after the couple's triumphant return to London. The atmosphere in the house was suffocatingly still, a stark contrast to the frenetic activity occurring within the birthing room. For hours, the heavy oak doors remained closed to the Duke, barring him from the one place he desperately wished to be. Richard Wickliffe, a man who commanded estates, influenced legislation, and had stared down the entirety of London society without blinking, found himself reduced to a helpless sentry, pacing the corridor until the stone floor seemed to wear thin beneath his boots. The silence of the house was punctuated only by the hurried footsteps of maids carrying basins of hot water and fresh linens, their faces grave and unreadable. Inside the room, Francesca was fighting a war of endurance. The romanticized notions of motherhood she had once harbored as a young debutante had evaporated, replaced by the primal, exhausting reality of bringing life into the world. It was a physical ordeal that stripped away all pretense of rank or title. She was not a duchess in that bed. She was simply a woman, at the mercy of nature. Yet even in the throes of exhaustion, her mind remained lucid, anchoring itself to the promise she had made to Richard that they would build a family together. When the midwife finally signaled that the time had come, the barriers of propriety were shattered. Richard, ignoring the protests of the traditionalists among his staff, entered the room. He did not come to command, but to witness. He took his place beside the bed, his hand gripping hers, providing a physical tether to the world outside her pain. The cry that finally shattered the tension was not a polite whimper, but a furious, lusty roar that echoed off the high ceilings. It was the sound of a new Wickliffe staking his claim on the world. The midwife's announcement was triumphant. A son, a healthy, vigorous heir. As the infant was cleaned and swaddled, the exhaustion in the room was instantly displaced by a profound, reverent awe. Richard looked down at the small, red-faced bundle in Francesca's arms, a child who possessed his grey eyes and his mother's determination, and the last vestiges of the stoic, lonely Duke dissolved. They named him Thomas, invoking the history of the ancestor who had founded their line, cementing the continuity of the past with the promise of the future. In the quiet weeks that followed the birth, a new rhythm established itself within the abbey. The nursery, silent for a generation, became the beating heart of the estate. It was during these long, quiet nights, while watching Thomas sleep, that Francesca and Richard finally addressed the phantom that had haunted the periphery of their happiness: the lost years. For a long time, Francesca had carried a silent guilt over the 3 years she had spent, engaged to Henry, viewing them as wasted time that had delayed their happiness. But in the clarity of new parenthood, a different truth emerged. They realized that the delay had not been a thief, but a teacher. Had they married 3 years earlier, Francesca would have been a girl infatuated with the idea of a title, and Richard would have been a man trying to buy affection with logic. The suffering, the betrayal, and the waiting had been the forge that tempered their souls. They had needed to lose each other to understand the value of what they found. Time, as it is wont to do when happiness is the governing principle, accelerated. The seasons turned over the Abbey gardens, transforming the landscape from the green of spring to the gold of autumn, and back again, marking the passage of a decade. 10 years after the scandalous midnight carriage ride, Westwick Abbey was no longer just a fortress of history. It was a home teeming with life. The gardens, once manicured to a sterile perfection, now bore the happy scars of childhood. Adventures. Thomas, now a 10-year-old with a penchant for climbing oaks that terrified his governess, had grown into a serious, thoughtful boy who mirrored his father's temperament. He was joined by Eleanor, a 7-year-old firebrand who possessed her mother's beauty and a terrifying lack of fear, and William, a 5-year-old dreamer who spent his days inventing dragons in the library. The family had expanded not just in number, but in purpose. Francesca and Richard had evolved into a formidable partnership. Their work in London had borne fruit. Richard's agricultural reforms had improved the lives of their tenants, while Francesca's charitable foundations had educated hundreds of children in the city's poorest districts. They moved through the world as a singular unit, their love story having transitioned from a scandalous headline to a pillar of the social order. Yet, the world outside their sanctuary had not been kind to everyone. News of Henry Talbert still drifted to them occasionally, carried by the inevitable currents of gossip. His fate had been a slow, grinding decline. His marriage to Georgiana Hartwell, the sugar heiress, had been a disaster of incompatibility. The fortune he had married for had been locked away in ironclad trusts by a suspicious father-in-law, leaving Henry with the title but none of the freedom. He had retreated to a modest estate, his looks faded by dissipation, a man consumed by bitterness and the realization that he had traded a diamond for a handful of glass. Francesca, upon hearing these updates, felt no triumph. The anger that had once burned so hot had cooled into a distant pity. Henry was a ghost of a life she had narrowly escaped, a living testament to the hollowness of choosing style over substance. The contrast between Henry's fate and Richard's promise was stark. On the night of their engagement, Richard had promised to write her poetry, not with words, but with actions. He had kept that vow with a religious fervor. There were no grand empty gestures of the kind Henry had favored. Instead, there was the poetry of the ordinary, the way Richard listened to her opinions on estate matters with genuine respect, the way he defended her fiercely against any slight, the way he looked at her across a crowded room after a decade of marriage with the same intensity he had shown in the carriage. He had proven that romance was not a performance for an audience, but a daily discipline of choosing the same person over and over again. One warm summer evening, after the children had been corralled into bed and the house had settled into silence, Francesca and Richard stood on the terrace of the Abbey. It was a mirror image of that fateful night at Ashford House, but the reflection was distorted by joy rather than despair. The air was filled with the scent of blooming roses rather than the stale perfume of a ballroom. Francesca leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the life they had built. She realized that the happily ever after of fairy tales was a lie, not because happiness was impossible, but because it wasn't a static endpoint. It was a process. They hadn't reached a destination. They were constantly building the road beneath their feet. She turned to Richard, studying the lines that time had etched around his eyes, lines of laughter and worry that she had helped create. She spoke of the night she fled London, admitting that for years she had viewed his carriage as a rescue, a vehicle. But looking back from the vantage point of a decade, she understood that he hadn't rescued her. He had simply opened a door. She was the one who had stepped through it. She was the one who had decided to burn her reputation to the ground in exchange for a chance at something real. The courage had been hers, the patience had been his. It was the perfect equation of their marriage. Richard, ever the man of few words, simply took her hand. He didn't need to make speeches. The life surrounding them was his speech. The laughter of their children, the prosperity of their tenants, the peace of the abbey, this was his declaration of love. He pointed out that while the carriage ride had been the catalyst, the true magic had been in the mundane days that followed, the days when the roof leaked, when the children were sick, when the bills needed paying. Those were the moments that had forged the iron bond between them. They had moved happily ever forward, navigating the complexities of life without ever letting go of each other's hands. As the moon rose high above the abbey towers, casting long silver shadows across the lawn, Francesca realized that the scandalous Duchess of Westwick had achieved the ultimate revenge on a society that had once judged her. She hadn't just survived, she had flourished. She had replaced the hollow perfection of a good match with the messy, glorious reality of a true union. The whispers of the ton had long since faded, silenced by the undeniable evidence of their enduring joy. The story of Francesca and Richard was no longer a scandal. It was a legend, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous choice is the safest one, and that the longest waits often yield the richest rewards. As they turned to go back inside, leaving the ghosts of the past in the dark garden, they walked into a future that was entirely, perfectly their own. And so, the carriage ride that began in desperation ended in a legacy of love that would echo through generations. Thank you for journeying with us through the trials and triumphs of the Duke and Duchess of Westwick. If their story of redemption, patience, and enduring love touched your heart, please verify that you are subscribed to our channel and have hit the notification bell. Your likes and comments help us bring more of these powerful narratives to life. But do not leave just yet. The tapestry of fate has many threads, and another story is waiting to be unraveled. On the screen right now is a tale of a secret betrothal and a kingdom at stake that you won't want to miss. Click it now to continue the adventure. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.